I became a time traveller. 2021. During that year, we built a grandparents' annex onto our property for my parents. It was connected to our part of the house by a small porch. And each time I ventured through this porch, I found myself going through a time portal. When I stepped out of our part of the house, it was the 2000s. But when I opened the door and stepped through into their part, I was immediately transported back in time into the 1940s. The first thing that struck me wasn't what I saw, it was what I heard. Music.
Love them all.
A swing band usually, playing music from the 30s and the 40s. The Andrews Sisters, the Glenn Miller Band, the sounds of the world they'd grown up in and the soundtrack to their courting days. The sounds my mum would have danced to every Saturday night at the dance hall on the end of Teignmouth Pier. Dad would have heard it too, but not inside, outside, where he waited for her to say goodbye to her friends and then he would walk her home. How she loved her dancing. She would often boast of winning this competition and that competition. He couldn't dance back then, but in time he came to love it as much as she did, and they spent many a happy afternoon going along to the happy dancing sessions at the local village hall, right up into their 80s. Music seemed to stir memories, which brought my dad to life, because by the time they moved in with us, he'd developed vascular dementia, and he had lost touch with the current day, as he had no short-term memory. But put on a bit of music from their era, and the memories would just come flooding back. I spent many an afternoon listening to their tales of their time in the sorting office where they worked together, how Dad had got the job there, how he'd put a word in for her and she'd got a job there, the gossip that went round, and they would both be giggling as they told their version. It seemed the sorting office was mainly staffed by men, and much of the talk was about what they'd got up to with their budgie over the weekend. Budgie was the first time I'd encountered this term, and when I questioned it, I was told, well, that's where the term bird comes from when you're referring to a girlfriend. Originally, it was budgie. Well, you learn something every day, don't you? Not only would they recall the stories, but also, surprisingly, after all the years had gone past, the names of the men and often the budgies' names too would come to mind. Memory is a mysterious thing. You would think that a visit from a friendly neighbour would stay in the mind for a while at least. But no, a few minutes after the neighbour had left, even after an hour of tea and conversation and laughter, Dad would struggle to remember who'd been sitting in the room with them, or if anybody had been at all. But somehow the men around that canteen table 16 years earlier remained crystal clear. All the names, the nicknames, the stories they told, the jokes they laughed at, and all the adventures they shared. The recent past just slipped through his fingers, just out of reach, while memories from long ago remain firmly anchored nearby, touchable and easily accessible. When Dad talked about those days, for a little while, the years just seemed to fall away, and I could see the scene quite clearly in my mind. There he was again, a young man in a brown work coat, sitting at the canteen table, surrounded by his friends, cigarette smoke hanging in the air despite the no smoking sign on display, a mug of tea and a lifetime still waiting to happen. It seems memory doesn't disappear evenly. It retreats like the tide. It leaves some things exposed and it carries others away. At least Mum would know the neighbourhood visited, and not only that, she'd be able to recall the conversation in detail later when she recorded the events of the day in her diary. Though, sadly, over time, she too developed dementia. Thankfully, Dad's vascular dementia affected him differently from many people with Alzheimer's. Although his memory was badly affected, he kept his humour, his love of chatting, and his gift for storytelling right to the end. One of the main stories often told in that 1940s lounge involved how Dad had managed to get the job in the sorting office in the first place. It wasn't a straightforward procedure. His father had wanted him to join the Navy, but he wasn't keen. To satisfy his father, though not fully aligned with his own ambitions, when he was just 16, he sat the civil service examination. The prize for that was a secure job with the post office, and for a boy from a family with very little money, it was an opportunity too good to miss. Also, these jobs were highly sought after in a world where secure employment was scarce. The civil service offered stability, and several hundred boys and girls from across Devon all sat the exam at the same time. A few weeks later, he received a letter informing him that he'd been placed in the top 10 of all candidates, confirming his academic ability. And yet he heard nothing further after that. Sometime later again, he met an old school friend on Teignmouth Beach, who had also taken the exam and mentioned that he was about to start work at the sorting office in Exeter. Now, Dad knew this boy had scored significantly lower than he had, and he was puzzled as to why he himself had not received a similar offer. After making inquiries, he discovered that proximity to the workplace had been considered. His friend lived close to Exeter, whereas Dad lived in Teignmouth, 15 miles away. However, he now owned a motorbike and he believed he could commute faster than many of those who had been offered jobs. When this argument failed to sway anyone, he took matters into his own hands, and with the help of a few friends, he timed his journey by motorbike from his house to the St David's post office. He then interviewed workers arriving there one morning, asking how long it took them to get to work. From this, he produced a simple report demonstrating that he could reach the sorting office actually more quickly than almost all the existing staff. Now, at the time, and actually for the rest of his life, he was a committed supporter of left-leaning politics and strongly opposed to what he saw as the unfair privileges of the landed gentry and the Conservative government. His local Member of Parliament for Totnes and the surrounding area, was elected in 1935, was very much an aristocrat. He'd recently completed Ashcombe House on a huge estate near Dawlish and was firmly conservative. Despite this political difference, Dad, still only 16 years old, summoned up the courage to visit this local MP at his grand home and present his carefully documented case against the civil service's hiring practices. The MP was impressed by his intelligence, his determination and his strong sense of fairness. The head of the post office was a government minister who regularly faced questioning in Parliament. This MP duly tabled a question for a future session, citing the 16-year-old's report as an example. And before the matter could become part of the official parliamentary record in Hansard, the minister acted, and Dad soon received word that he'd been offered a position at the post office, and he began work at the post office in late 1938. Can you imagine? Here he is, a 16-year-old boy, effectively carrying out his own transport survey, interviewing workers, timing journeys on his motorbike, writing a report, and then marching off to challenge the system. But that was him to a T. That quiet determination and systematic approach to problem solving is probably why he had such a meteoric career, starting out as a 16-year-old in the sorting office and ending with him being a director of British Telecom in charge of telecommunications for Wales and the Marches. After he passed away, I found those letters. The letters were exchanged during this period between him and the post office and the government. He had saved them all, including the one asking him to attend for a medical prior to taking up the position. The line that stands out for me is, "It has been decided to relax exceptionally in Mr. Hayward's favour the condition as regards locality of residence." What a sense of achievement and pride that would have given him. No wonder he kept them. Most 16-year-olds who were told you can't have the job because you live too far away would have shrugged and moved on. He didn't. He gathered evidence. He found someone with influence. Even though he didn't like his politics, he did recognise where the power lay. He presented his case and asked for the decision to be reconsidered. I think that was an astonishingly mature approach for a boy of that age in 1938. Over the years, I've kept CDs from the 40s in my car, as most journeys with them became a chance to visit that era again. They're actually still there, which is why one of my granddaughter's favourite songs that we always had to play whenever she was in the car in her toddler years was, and I think actually may even still be one of her favourites now she's 18, the Boogie Woogie Boogie Boy from Company 3. She'd jump in the car and immediately say, "Boogie Woogie Boy, Nanny, Boogie Woogie Boy, Nanny." And I'd put on the CD, the Andrews Sisters would come on, and off we'd go singing along. I actually came to enjoy the 40s music almost as much as they did. I don't listen to music much, I must admit. I prefer to listen to drama and quizzes, etc. But when I am in the mood, I often ask Alexa to play Glenn Miller. I enjoyed these afternoons time travelling, and I hope you've enjoyed my telling of a couple of stories from them. When I stepped through that door into the 40s, I left the present day outside, and in a way I think that's what happened to Dad. The present day was always just outside. He knew it was there, but it was just out of his reach. Here's a little interesting postscript my brother discovered. It turned out that the MP who'd taken on Dad's case was Brigadier Sir Ralph Rayner. At the time, neither of these two men could have imagined that only a few years later, in 1945, both of those who'd stood on the doorstep that day would find themselves connected to one of the most infamous places in history, Adolf Hitler's bunker. Sir Ralph was among the first British officers to enter it and was given Hitler's telephone by the Red Army. Dad would later walk through the same bunker himself, and he also brought something of Hitler's away with him. But that's another story you can check out. Just look at my video titled, "What's That in Our Hall Cupboard?" Thank you for joining me on this ramble through the Red Box. You may have heard or seen I've called the channel the Red Box Ramblings, as I'm using my mother's very detailed diaries that sit in a big red box in my hallway as a source of inspiration for these videos. If you're intending to join me again, maybe you better go in search of those rambling boots you've got tucked away in a cupboard somewhere and stand them by the back door ready. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please click the like and subscribe buttons, and that way you'll be notified when I release a new one. And there's a lot more where this came from. In the meantime, happy rambling.